Okay, once it's finished creating its VI, you'll see that there's a data bar that comes down here. You're going to go to this arrow here, and this is where the output is from the DAQ. So whatever data you're putting into this DAQ, running through LabView, and it's going to come out in this data section. So there's two ways to display this data using a graph. You can either right click on the little triangle here, then create graphic indicator, or you can go to your front panel, right click, get your controls palette, and then go to graph indicators and waveform graph, and you're going to place the waveform graph in there, and then you can connect the two together. So I'm going to take this little arrow and connect it to my waveform graph, so my data is going to come in from my DAQ, go along this little wire here, and display in the waveform graph. Now, in order to avoid you having to completely go back into that one window, that configuration window for the DAQ, you would have to double click this or right click and go to control and go to properties to bring that menu up again. Then you could change your number of samples and your sampling frequency. Now that takes time because every time you hit OK, it'll start and rebuild your VI again. So a way around that is to create a control for the number of samples and the sampling frequency so that you can change it right here on the front panel without having to go through all that work of waiting to let it give you the menu, and then after you hit your changes, go to build VI. So to do that, if you hover your mouse over here in the center section to where you see the arrows up and down like when you drag a picture and change its resolution, you can drag it down all the way, and then you see all these little options here. If I hover over to the number of samples, I can right click, create control. And what that's going to do is create a control, so now I can control the number of samples without having to go in to the DAQ's properties again and fix everything and redo it. So I can change it right here to whatever I want without having to wait that. And I'll also do the same thing for the rate. So now I can change the rate and the number of samples and without having to go through and waiting for the DAQ to be set up again. Now the last thing that you're going to probably want to do is save everything that you see in this graph to a file. And luckily, LabView can do that. And you can do that by going to your block diagram, right click, output, write to measurements file, and place it in there. It's going to take a minute to show up, and once it's done showing up, you get this dialog box here. So I can choose where I want to place this file. So right now I'm going to choose this little folder, and this is going to be where it saves my files. If I were you, I would bring in your USB flash drive and I would put it onto your computer before you do this, and then navigate to it and have it save it in your flash drive itself. So I'm going to save mine on my desktop, and I'm going to call it test. You can call it whatever you want. Then hit OK, and now we can change the rest of it. So we're going to use next available file name. This way it doesn't overwrite or rename existing files or do anything that we don't want it to do. So it's basically going to write, the first time you run it, it's going to write a file named test. The second time you run it, it's going to name a file test1, so on and so forth. Now the file format's fine. Segment headers, I'm going to do only one header only. This way I don't get a header for each segment, which basically means each channel would have its own header, so I don't really want that. And then I'm going to change X values, the time columns, to one time column only, so I always get my time values out. Now, there will be a time when you're going to want to use one column per channel. Say you have multiple graphs, and one graph is not time, and the other graph is time. Then, if you only do one column only, it's going to only export the time graph, and then it won't export the other X values. So therefore, you're going to only have one X values you're going to refer to. So if you want two different X values, one for each channel, it's better to do that. Then we're going to keep the delimiter as tabular. Then you're going to hit OK. And now you have the write to measurements file set up. All we need to do is now have the data that you want to write to this measurement file come into this point where it says signals. So I'm just going to click on that little arrow, and I'm going to click on the wire that we made, and I'm going to connect it. So now the data is going to come in through the data, go through this wire, go to the waveform graph, and go to write to measurements file. Now, you're going to think about this is if you keep on running many times, you're going to get a lot of data files. You're going to get maybe hundreds or even thousands if you run it continuously. it's not only going to flood your file that you flood like your desktop with a bunch of files, or flood your flash drive with a bunch of text files. So what you can do is you can create a control telling your computer when to enable and disable this feature. So you can basically tell it when to run and save, when to save the files and when not to save the files. So if you look at these little arrows over here next to this little symbol, go to the one that says enable right here. We're going to right click, create control. So whenever this little box here says enable, it's going to save a file whenever I hit run. And if I choose it on the right one where I get my this little finger here, I click on it, it says disabled. So every time I run it, it's not going to save a file. So the good thing about this is that whenever you run your data and trying to get the data you want, and once you get the data you want, you can hit enable, run it again, and save your data once so you don't have a bunch of files. So I'm going to enable it for right now to show you what happens when you run it. So I'm just going to click run. Here's run. This is run continuously. Stop. And this is the pause your run. So I'm going to hit run. So it's going to collect 1,000 samples and a rate of 1,000. So just give me a second. So right now it's running. Now it stopped because it showed its graph. So I still had it enabled. So now if I go to my desktop, I should see a file. You can see here it ran the file, ran my VI, and then it exported this data and test. Now you can right click this file and open with Microsoft Excel, and it will automatically open up in Excel so that you can see your data that you just exported. So here it has my headers, which basically tells me what I have done, and it keeps everything all nice and organized. So this is basically telling you when it was run, who it was run by, what all your other options were. And if you look down here, you can see that it tells you how many channels you have, the number of samples, and all that information. And then it has your data. You have your first column is your X values, your second column is your Y values, and you can create and modify the data any means possible. So I'm going to close out of that and hit no change. So now if I go back to LabView, I say I wanted to do a different sampling rate, I just change it to a different number. Like say I wanted to go 100 samples, that's a rate of 200. Then I would just hit run. It would run it again. And then if you go back to my desktop, you see that there's a test1 file now. That's because I left the box enabled for me to write a file, and then I ran it again, so it didn't rename test1, it named the next available file name, which is 1. So if I run it again, I'm going to get 2. If I run it again, I'm going to get 3. So after you're done, you can just close out of the files. My recommendation is to make this at home, save it, and bring it to the lab, and then just place it in the DAQ assist like I showed you how to do here. And then you can just come in and start doing your lab very, very easily. If you ever run into errors or ever you have any questions about LabView, you can always ask your TA, and they should be able to help you with everything. So once you're done on the computer itself in the lab, you don't have to save the file, the VI, if you've already have it with you from home. But otherwise, I'm not going to save it because I don't need it anymore. And that's it.